wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'm not a health expert either. I'm a community organiser and a campaigner. And look, I wanted to give some of that broader perspective, particularly about coal seam gas across New South Wales, across Australia, and really focusing on the case study of Gloucester. And I guess, so I wanted to give that view from those communities we've been working with, of course the politics, but speak a little bit to the mental health impacts of this industry rolling out across Australia. You know, the coal seam gas, the unconventional gas industry has developed relatively recently, and it developed very quickly. So for a very long time, communities in Queensland and New South Wales really played catch up, and these gas fields were approved without health impact studies. The environmental impact statements say very little, if nothing, about the potential health impacts of them. And they were approved without baseline health testing, which puts communities like Camden and in Queensland in a really difficult situation, because they're complaining about very significant health impacts on them and their children and their animals, some of them, those that are farmers, and they have no way to prove it because those baseline studies were not done. And that's really difficult for people. They can't go up in court against many of these companies. They haven't been able to. Many have tried. But it makes it really, really tough to prove some of these impacts. And it makes it harder for communities who are facing potential gas fields as well, because they don't have short or long-term studies to point to show the real impacts of this industry on human health. And I just wanted to start with a few facts that might fly by you, but just to look at who actually lives in a gas field, or who could live in a gas field. Where is this risk? Because the area of Australia currently covered by some sort of gas licence, unconventional gas licence, is greater than the area of Western Australia, which of course is almost half of the entire continent. So 6% of Victoria is covered by some form of gas licence. 29% of Tasmania, though that community there has successfully pushed for a 5-year moratorium. 61% of South Australia, pretty big state, that's 602,000 kilometres squared covered in gas fields. Western Australia is enormous, more than 20% of Western Australia, so 500,000 kilometres squared. The Northern Territory is the big one. 85% of the Northern Territory, which is 1.13 million kilometres squared, is covered in gas licences. 85% of the Northern Territory. And, when we think about who has to live in a gas field, who might, who's, going around every day with the threat of this on their families or on their land or on their country, in particular, it is people who are living in rural areas, Aboriginal people, traditional owners in the Northern Territory and South Australia. That is the big chunks of Australia that are currently impacted by this industry. Some of the most remote and vulnerable people living on the continent. Of course, Queensland is where the unconventional gas industry is most developed, so 24% of Queensland is currently covered by licences. And there's over 12,000 wells in Queensland. And some of these are, in rural areas, but people live there, people farm there, and there are some really enormous impacts that they're reporting that it's having on their health and their livelihoods. And then coming to New South Wales, which of course I'm most familiar with, there's been a really big shift, and that's really thanks to an enormous movement working very, very hard over the last 5 years to stop this industry in its tracks. So just about 18 months ago, 78% of New South Wales was covered in coal seam gas licences approved by successive governments in New South Wales. And today, thanks to enormous campaigning, that number is now down to 7% of New South Wales. So 78% of New South Wales to 7%. It's a really big shift. It's a really big victory. And that's due to farmers and community members in Gloucester, in Bentley, around Lismore and the Northern Rivers, Moree in the Southern Highlands, and of course, just 1 year ago, coal seam gas licence covered the very spot that we're standing here in Glebe, covered the entirety of Sydney, an AGL licence, extended from the Illawarra all the way through to the Central Coast, out west to Blacktown, And that licence covered Sydney, and of course there was a really amazing campaign. They tried to drill, some of you might remember, in St Peter's at the end of King Street. Like, imagine that, a gas company trying to drill at the end of King Street in St Peter's and Newtown, thinking that they were going to build a gas field here, you know, in a very dense and, you know, major city of the world. I'm very glad the people of Sydney organised so strongly to stop that and stop it successfully. So look, just last weekend I was in the Pilliga Forest with my elderly grandparents for my family reunion with over 100 members of my family, because my family's been farming out there largely on Wiradjuri land and on the edge of Gamilaroi land for over 100 years. And there are people right now camped in the Pilliga Forest because the only remaining proposed major new coal seam gas project is the Santos project in the northwest of New South Wales near Narrabri, and they're proposing to build a gas field of 850 wells in the Pilliga State Forest. And that forest is beautiful, but it's also the most important recharge zone in New South Wales for the Great Artesian Basin, that vast expanse of water that covers so much of this continent, a huge proportion of this continent, that so many of our forests and farmers rely on to really, you know, feed and water the environment we live in. And so Santos, they're the last remaining company in New South Wales who are trying to build a new gas field. And they have gas licences that cover 6 million hectares of New South Wales. So that's 7% that's still covered in gas licences. It's pretty much all Santos. They own gas licences, you know, throughout, you know, from Gilgandra to Coonabarabran to Canamble, all the way north to the Queensland border. The Santos licences in New South Wales cover an area that's bigger than the size of Norway. It's not a small parcel of land, and it's a land that, in their eyes, they've wanted to develop. They sort of have their eyes now on a serious proposal of 850 wells in the Pilliga Forest. But their previous prospectus as a company have shown that they want to develop multiple gas fields in the northwest of New South Wales. Now look, it's not looking rosy for Santos. The oil and gas markets absolutely have crashed in the last 2 years. And so has Santos's share price. They have been looking for people to buy into the project, looking for people to finance the project, looking for people to share that risk with them. Other companies aren't interested. And so the next 6 months really are crucial for the Great Artesian Basin, for the Pilliga Forest, for the farming communities in the northwest of New South Wales, because they need to show that they have the support of people in the city, and that Santos are going to feel an awful lot of pain if they try to go ahead and continue building that gas field in New South Wales. But they are building the groundwork of it. So right now they are constructing the wastewater treatment plant in that area, because there's already a vast amount of wastewater there from their exploratory activities. And that's particularly what people are worried about. So they're worried about the impact of coal seam gas, those 850 wells, to be drilled through the Great Artesian Basin, because the coal seam lies well below it, about 1 kilometre underground. So they're going to drill 850 wells through the Great Artesian Basin to get to the coal seam below. A lot goes wrong when you drill that deep. And you know, how long do we know that those wells are going to last? And there's no way that they can guarantee that that concrete casing will, hold its integrity for 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years, of course. So I want to come to Gloucester, of course, because that's the most recent victory. You know, there are a few thousand people in Gloucester, but there are 75,000 people downstream in Foster, in Tuncurry, in Wingham, in Taree, who rely on that water as their drinking water. So they got really involved in the campaign because they didn't want to see coal seam gas fracking to have an impact on their drinking water. They did a whole bunch of fracking Christmas before last of 4 wells, and there were 50 families and a major dairy that were located within 2 kilometres of that fracking. And people continually asked AGL what were they going to do with the wastewater, because there's the flowback water, so AGL pump a whole bunch of chemicals and water and a cocktail into the seam to crack open the seam so the gas can flow. And then they also have to get all of that out, and then they have to what they call de-water the coal seam. So coal seams are actually quite wet and they've got to get some of that water out so that the gas can flow. So there's enormous amounts of wastewater. Some of it has fracking chemicals in it. Some of it has other elements that appear in the coal seam. And some of it is highly saline as well. So the community were asking AGL, well, what are you going to do with the wastewater? And they just could not get an answer. They put in freedom of information applications, they protested the company, everything, they couldn't get an answer. So they followed the wastewater trucks from Gloucester all the way to Newcastle, screaming down the highway, 130 kilometres an hour at times. And they found that those trucks were going to Newcastle and were part of uncovering that those trucks were dumping coal seam gas wastewater into the Newcastle sewer system without being treated. That was obviously flowing through Newcastle and out to sea. It wasn't tested for benzene or a range of other toxic chemicals. And of course, this was the one thing that Hunter Water had expressly told AGL and their contractor not to do. So AGL were fined, they were investigated, and of course they could no longer dispose of wastewater there. So AGL moved on to their next solution, which was recycling the wastewater in Western Sydney, which was another arrangement that fell through. They attempted to use the coal seam gas water to irrigate crops that were fed to dairy cows, and that trial was abandoned after unacceptable levels of salt and heavy metals accumulated in the soil. AGL called that trial a success. It was abandoned, like, make no mistake, but they called it a successful trial nonetheless. And you know, those were problems and more that stemmed from just 4 weeks of fracking 4 wells, and that community was facing 330. And I just wanted to take a moment to think about, you know, what that community went through in uncovering that. Because, you know, they had to ask those questions again and again and get no answer and be told it was safe. You know, Ed Robinson and Tina Robinson, local beef farmers with a beautiful view of the AGL gas field, about 500 metres away, maybe a kilometre tops. You know, they had to, you know, tell people that were buying their beef that it was safe and that there was no risk. But they were deeply worried that one day there would be a risk. And the people who lived in the vicinity where there were trucks going down their street day in, day out, and a planning process and a campaign process that took, you know, almost a decade. That takes an enormous toll out of people, and it's deeply stressful because it's also, a lot of people retired in Gloucester and they sunk all of their retirement savings in these properties that then they couldn't sell because they were living in a gas field. Who wants to buy into a gas field? So there were just an enormous number of people who were really stuck financially, who couldn't sleep, partially because of stress and worry, but also because of those trucks and those lights and the gas flaring that were happening, you know, just a kilometre or two from their homes. And also there was an enormous amount of division that came in that town that people are trying really hard to heal at the moment. You know, where, you know, there's an awful lot of unemployment in rural Australia, and people, you know, will welcome any job that comes to town. So there was part of that town who really wanted to see a new industry come and set up and potentially create employment. But there were others who would potentially lose their farm and their livelihood and the jobs they provided for their family and for their employees as well. So it really pit two parts of the town against each other in ways that relationships that people had had since childhood, since high school, their kids had grown up together, you know, over many decades, really fractured, that created really enormous points of emotional stress. And I really don't want to underestimate, you know, how huge those mental health impacts are in these communities that are facing a really hard time and trying to find a way to the future. And probably the most acute example of that was about 6 months ago, I think. AGL were like, oh, people are very stressed, aren't they, here in Gloucester? They're very stressed. Why don't we pay for and invite the Beyond Blue bus to come to Gloucester? And those of you who don't know, Beyond Blue, major national, you know, fantastic mental health charity. Obviously they partner with companies sometimes, which I'm totally cool with. But in this instance, I wasn't. Because the Beyond Blue bus, you know, came to Gloucester, a town that was, you know, really between a rock and a hard place and suffering enormous mental health and stress. The Beyond Blue bus came and AGL said, yes, we've brought the Beyond Blue bus to you to help you all with your mental health. And the AGL employees stood at the entry to the bus the bus where people were meant to walk past them and to go and get mental health support from professionals, which is pretty hard to come by in a rural area. So, that was sort of one of the most acute examples of a company knowing that they'd caused enormous emotional stress, looking like they were doing something about it and making a bad problem a lot worse in the process. So I just wanted to come to, why are we here? How did this industry develop? What comes next? And, vast parts of Australia were covered in gas licences because there was this great hope that the global gas market was going to absolutely boom. International prices were enormous, so much more than anyone in Australia was prepared to pay, and that these companies were going to get a whole bunch of gas out of the ground really quickly, ship it all off overseas and make a mozza. And, there are a few people in there who believed that, of course, gas, it's a bit better than coal maybe, and maybe it'll help the global climate. And that's another area, I think, when we talk about the lack of health studies, there has been, in Australia in particular, a real failure to look at the fugitive emissions, the gas that escapes from wells, coal seam gas wells in Australia. In some parts of the US, which is shale, a little bit different to the coal seam gas, but unconventional gas nonetheless, it's possible that in some areas that coal seam gas, in a climate pollution sense, is far dirtier than some coal mining. So, but it was also believed that demand was rising. People were going to get on board with gas, everyone wanted it, there was going to be so much more demand, and prices and profits would just go up and up. There was uncertainty a decade ago about the reliability and affordability of renewable energy, and let me tell you that uncertainty is long gone. If we look at global investment in renewable energy, it was double in the last year of global investment in coal and gas. Double. Renewables are outstripping coal and gas together. It's a fantastic global shift. But meanwhile, demand for gas has massively dropped. Demand in New South Wales for household gas use dropped by 9% last year. Business use dropped by 15%. So, but consumers are actually paying more. So it's not just communities here at the coalface that are, really getting shafted by this industry. It's all of the consumers in the city as well. We're using less and less. We're paying more and more. Something here isn't adding up. But I think the tide really is turning. So our challenge in New South Wales is, of course, to push back on that last remaining new proposal, the Santos proposal in Narrabri. Make sure you get online, any opportunity you can get to support farmers, traditional owners and community members around the northwest to stop the Santos coal seam gas project in the Pilliga. Give them your full support. And of course, getting behind people in Camden so that they're not stuck with a toxic gas field 75, 100, 200 metres away from their homes and their families till 2023. That'll about wrap it up in New South Wales, but of course there are other states, communities in Queensland, in South Australia, particularly the Northern Territory as well. This is by no means over, and we really do need ongoing activism and support. I think that we can beat this industry. Those areas, 85% of Northern Territory covered in licences, those gas fields aren't built. And by continuing to build a movement in New South Wales, particularly through the Lock the Gate Alliance, which is a national organisation. They've got incredible Aboriginal community organisers in Burraloola and the Northern Territory and Alice Springs across Western Australia. That alliance is going to be the one that brings communities together to beat this, but to turn the corner, to build renewable energy for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Holly and Nick.